My sons didn't show up at my retirement party, too busy with their important lives to honor a father who sacrificed everything. And then a letter arrived, whose words struck me deeper than their absence. After that, my phone lit up with 63 missed calls from my family. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you were listening in the comments. The phone hit the cradle with a violence that made the lampshade tremble. My third call. 3 sons, 3 unanswered rings echoing back like slaps across my weathered face. "Damn it all to pieces," I muttered, staring at the dining table I'd spent 2 hours perfecting. Every fork aligned, every napkin creased just so. The roast beef sat cooling in the oven, potatoes growing that gray film they get when hope dies slowly. I adjusted the centerpiece again. My mother's china roses, the ones that survived 43 moves between company housing and apartments that smelled like other people's disappointments. Elvin used to love these Sunday dinners when he was 8, before computers taught him that his old man's stories about the steel mill were just noise between his important thoughts. The clock read 6:15. They were already late, but that was normal. Success makes you fashionably delayed, I'd learned. I picked up the phone again, dialed Elvin's number with fingers that shook just slightly. Age, nerves, hard to tell anymore. "Hello, Elvin. Where are you, son? The party's already started and your favorite roast is getting cold." My voice carried that forced cheer that sounds like aluminum foil between your teeth. The rings stretched on, 1, 2, 3, 4. Before voicemail clicked in with his crisp professional greeting, I hung up without leaving a message. No point begging a busy man. By 6:45, I'd checked the food 6 times, repositioned the chairs twice, and worn a path to the front window. Every car that turned onto Maple Street made my chest flutter like I was 16 again, waiting for a prom date who might not show. None of them stopped. Gren's number came next. Maybe the kids were sick. His twins caught everything that blew through their preschool. That would explain the silence. "Gren, are your kids sick? Why haven't you come? Your children were asking about their grandpa last week." The desperation leaked through despite my efforts. "The food's ready, son. I made that cornbread you used to steal from the cooling rack." Voicemail again. His voice sounded younger on the recording, happier. Back when he still returned calls from the man who taught him to tie his shoes. The house felt enormous and empty, like a museum after closing time. Shadows stretched longer across walls that had witnessed 40 years of my sons growing up, growing away, growing into strangers who shared my name but not my time. At 7:15, desperation drove me to dial Delmare, my youngest, my last hope. The rebel who still hugged me at Christmas, though his embraces felt more like parole than affection. "Delmare, please call me back when you get this message." My voice cracked like old leather. "Your brothers. They didn't come tonight. I thought maybe you—" I couldn't finish. The words sat in my throat like broken glass. By 8G, understanding settled over me like a cold blanket. No emergency had kept them away. No crisis demanded their attention elsewhere. They'd simply decided that Cornelius Edwards' 67th birthday wasn't worth 2 hours of their precious time. The realization hit harder than any punch I'd taken in my steelworking days. My boys, the men I'd raised, fed, clothed, protected, had collectively chosen to ignore the man who'd given them everything he had. I began clearing the table with mechanical precision, stacking plates that had never held food, folding napkins that had never touched lips. Each movement felt like disassembling my own funeral before the mourners arrived. 40 years, I whispered to the empty dining room. 40 years I worked for them. 40 years of double shifts so they could have new sneakers and college funds and everything I never had. The china clinked against itself as I carried it back to the cabinet, each piece a memory of better times when my sons fought over who got to help set the table, when they cared enough to fight about anything involving their father. Exhaustion finally drove me back to my chair, where a stack of mail waited, bills and advertisements I'd ignored while preparing for a party that existed only in my foolish imagination. I slumped into the seat, feeling every one of my 67 years pressing against my bones. On top of the pile sat a white envelope, handwritten in script I recognized immediately. Stella Campbell, my childhood friend, the girl who'd known me before marriage, children, and the slow death of dreams. My hands trembled as I lifted Stella's letter from the stack, her familiar handwriting dancing slightly in my tired vision. We'd exchanged Christmas cards for 30 years, but personal letters were rare, save for deaths, divorces, and other disasters that required more than holiday greetings. The envelope felt heavier than paper should, weighted with importance I could sense but not yet understand. I slid my finger under the seal, breaking it with the careful precision of a man who'd learned that rushing important things only led to regret. The cream-colored paper unfolded to reveal Stella's neat script, each word formed with the penmanship they'd beaten into us back in grade school when teachers still believed in permanence. "Dear Corny," it began, the nickname only she still used, a relic from our childhood when the world was smaller, and my biggest worry was whether she'd share her lunch cookies. "I ran into your sons at Riverside Cafe last Tuesday. When I mentioned you, their faces changed in a way that broke my heart." My chest tightened. The Riverside Cafe sat 15 minutes from my house, close enough that my boys could visit whenever the mood struck. Apparently, the mood struck them for coffee, but not for their father. I heard from mutual friends that they consider you old-fashioned and boring. Elvin actually laughed when someone mentioned your birthday party, saying you still acted like they were children who needed to show up for every little celebration. The words hit like physical blows. Each sentence stripped away another layer of the comfortable lies I'd been telling myself about my relationship with my sons. They didn't just ignore me, they mocked me, to friends, to strangers, to anyone who'd listen. My breathing became shallow, quick gasps that made the room spin slightly. I gripped the letter's edges until the paper wrinkled, rereading the worst parts to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. Little celebration. My birthday had become a joke to them, something quaint and pathetic that their backwards father insisted on treating like it mattered. I forced myself to continue reading, though each word felt like swallowing ground glass. "Gren mentioned that you still call them every week, as if they don't have their own lives to manage." He said it kindly, but the embarrassment was clear. Delmare just nodded along, looking uncomfortable but not disagreeing. The betrayal cut deeper than anger. It reached that place where love lived, poisoning it with the knowledge that my children were ashamed of me. Not just inconvenienced or too busy, but genuinely embarrassed by the man who'd sacrificed everything for their futures. "You deserve better, Corny. You were a good father who worked himself to exhaustion for those boys. Don't let them forget who you were for them, even if they've forgotten who they are to you." The letter ended with her signature and a postscript. Sometimes people need to be reminded of what they're losing before they lose it forever. I sat in stunned silence, the letter trembling in my hands as Stella's words echoed through my mind. The empty dining table seemed to mock me now, not just tonight's failure, but years of failures I'd been too blind to see. My sons didn't love me. They tolerated me, occasionally, when convenience allowed. I was an obligation they managed, a duty they fulfilled, with the minimum effort required to avoid guilt. The physical pain in my chest intensified, radiating down my left arm like warning bells I was too heartbroken to heed. Everything I'd believed about my family had been stripped away in 3 paragraphs of careful handwriting. The first buzz came at exactly 9:15, my phone lighting up with Elvin's name flashing across the screen. I stared at it without moving, watching the call go to voicemail as the device vibrated against the wooden table like an angry insect. Before the screen could fade to black, it lit up again. Gren this time, then Delmare, then Elvin again, his name appearing with the desperate persistence of a man who'd suddenly realized something was wrong. The calls came in waves, rapid, frantic bursts that made my phone dance across the table's surface. Each buzz felt like an electric shock, but I kept my hands folded in my lap, watching the parade of missed calls pile up like accusations. 63 calls in 15 minutes. A new record for paternal attention, though it came 3 hours too late to mean anything other than damage control. My phone began buzzing with text messages, the notification sounds building into a crescendo of artificial urgency. I picked it up finally, scrolling through the desperate digital pleas with the detached interest of a scientist examining specimens. "Dad, where are you? Why aren't you answering? We're worried." Elvin's text carried the commanding tone he used with his subordinates, as if concern could be ordered into existence. "Please call back. The kids are asking about Grandpa." Gren's message made me laugh, a bitter sound that echoed off the empty walls. The kids were probably asleep and had probably never asked about me at all. "Corny, what happened? Answer us." Even Delmare had joined the chorus, though his message felt more genuine than his brother's. Guilt had always been his weakness. I set the phone face down and listened to it buzz against the table, each vibration another missed opportunity for connection that had come hours too late. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd ignored my calls when I needed them, but expected immediate responses when their convenience demanded it. Now they're worried, I said to the empty room, my voice carrying a hardness that surprised me. I wonder why. The answer came with crystalline clarity. Someone had told them about my party, about the unanswered calls, about the old man sitting alone with his perfect table and cooling food. Guilt was a powerful motivator, but it made a poor substitute for genuine affection. My phone continued its electronic tantrum, but I was already thinking beyond tonight's humiliation. Stella's letter had opened my eyes to truths I'd been too afraid to see, and my son's panicked calls only confirmed what she'd written. They were worried, not about me, but about themselves, about how my silence reflected on them, about what people might think if word spread that Cornelius Edwards' boys had abandoned him on his birthday. Image management. That's all this was. Damage control from men who'd built their lives on the foundation of my sacrifices, but wanted to forget the builder. I picked up the phone one final time, reading through their increasingly desperate messages with the cold calculation of a man who'd finally stopped believing in fairy tales. They needed me to respond, to absolve them of tonight's cruelty with my usual forgiveness and understanding. But absolution required repentance, and panic wasn't the same thing as genuine remorse. I turned the phone completely off, cutting the electronic umbilical cord that had connected me to my son's world of calculated emotions and convenient love. The silence that followed felt like freedom. Tomorrow, I decided, would bring changes. Tonight had taught me valuable lessons about the difference between being a father and being a fool. My boys wanted their inheritance from a man they considered boring and old-fashioned. They could have it, but they'd earn every penny in ways they never expected from their predictable, embarrassing father. Sleep had been a stranger that night, but morning brought clarity like cold water splashed across my face. By 10 o'clock, I'd arranged the living room chairs in a precise semicircle, each positioned exactly 18 inches from the coffee table. Military precision, my father would have called it. The same attention to detail that had kept him alive in Korea and me employed for 40 years. 3 chairs for 3 sons, 1 chair for their father, positioned slightly higher on the raised section near the fireplace. Psychology wasn't rocket science when you'd spent decades managing steelworkers who thought they were smarter than their supervisors. Elvin arrived first, naturally. His black BMW pulled into my driveway at exactly 10:25, because successful men always arrive fashionably early to demonstrate their busy schedules. Through the window, I watched him check his phone twice before approaching the door, his Italian leather briefcase swinging like a weapon. "Dad?" His voice carried that professional tone he used with subordinates who'd disappointed him. "What's this about? I have a conference call with Singapore in an hour. Sit down." I gestured to the chair I'd selected for him, the one with the broken spring that would keep him slightly off balance. "We're waiting for your brothers." Gren's family van rumbled up 5 minutes later, engine knocking like an old man's joints. He jogged to the door with that perpetual hurried energy of a man who lived his life apologizing for being late. Sorry, had to drop the twins with Mrs. Henderson. Emma's still fighting that fever, and Nellie was worried about leaving them with anyone else." His explanation tumbled out before I'd even asked, guilt making him verbose. "Is everything okay? You sounded strange on the phone." "Everything's fine. Take a seat." Delmare's motorcycle announced his arrival with a roar that probably woke half the neighborhood. He stumbled through my door, looking like he'd slept in yesterday's clothes, which he probably had. The smell of cheap beer and regret followed him like cologne. "All right, I'm here," he mumbled, collapsing into the remaining chair without ceremony. "What's the emergency?" I studied my sons in silence, noting how they avoided eye contact with each other, and with me. Elvin checked his phone every 30 seconds. Gren fidgeted with his wedding ring. Delmare stared at his boots like they contained the secrets of the universe. "I called you here to discuss what happened yesterday," I began, my voice carrying the measured tone of a foreman addressing workers who'd broken equipment. Elvin straightened immediately, launching into damage control mode. "Dad, I'm so sorry about yesterday. We had this critical client meeting with Tokyo stakeholders that couldn't be rescheduled. The project's worth $3 million and I'm not finished." The steel in my voice cut through his explanation like a blade. He closed his mouth, probably for the first time in years, without finishing a sentence. Gren, my middle son flushed red as fresh paint. Emma spiked a fever, and we had to rush to urgent care. Nellie was panicking. You know how she gets when the kids are sick. The doctor said it was just a virus, but we couldn't leave until... Delmare? My youngest looked up with eyes that had seen too much of whatever he'd been drowning in lately. I just forgot, okay? I'm sorry. I've had a lot on my mind lately. Work's been crazy and... Stop. The single word silenced all three of them. I've heard enough. For the next 30 minutes, I let them elaborate their excuses, watching each performance with the detached interest of a theater critic reviewing amateur productions. Elvin's story grew more complex with each retelling, involving international time zones and corporate emergencies that sounded impressive to anyone who'd never managed real crises. Gren's medical drama expanded to include detailed symptoms and doctor consultations that would have taken hours to resolve. Delmare just kept apologizing and mentioning mysterious problems he refused to specify. Lies, all of it. Elaborate constructions designed to absolve them of guilt while making me feel selfish for expecting their presence at something as trivial as their father's birthday. You've all said your pieces, I announced when their explanations finally exhausted themselves. Now, I have something to say. I reached for the 3 manila envelopes I'd prepared that morning, placing them on the coffee table with deliberate precision. Each envelope bore a name written in my careful handwriting. The same script I'd used to sign permission slips and report cards back when being their father meant something more than being their disappointment. Their eyes fixed on those envelopes like birds watching a snake. The room fell silent, except for the wall clock ticking away seconds that felt like hours. I have a proposition for each of you. The manila envelopes sat between us like loaded weapons, their contents hidden but somehow threatening. Open them. Elvin reached for his envelope first. Always the take-charge son. His fingers tore through the paper with the efficiency of a man accustomed to important documents. Gren and Delmare followed more cautiously, their movements hesitant as if they sensed approaching danger. 3 identical documents emerged, inheritance papers meticulously prepared by Henderson and Associates, the same law firm that had handled my father's estate 30 years ago. Each son's eyes widened as they scanned the numbers, the legal terminology, the scope of assets they'd never bothered to ask about. $700,000, I said quietly, watching their faces transform. Each. That's what 40 years in the steel mill, careful investing, and your mother's life insurance has accumulated. Delmare actually whistled, a low sound that betrayed his financial desperation. Gren's hands trembled slightly as he held the papers. Elvin's face remained professionally neutral, but I caught the quick calculation behind his eyes. $700,000 would buy a lot of corporate advancement. There's a condition. I leaned back in my chair, savoring their sudden attention. You'll receive your inheritance when you prove you remember what family means. What kind of condition? Elvin's lawyer instincts activated immediately, scanning the document for fine print. 1 month, each of you, living here with me. The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. Elvin first, then Gren, then Delmare. 3 months total. Dad, this is impossible. Elvin shot to his feet, pacing the narrow space between chairs. I have deadlines, clients depending on me. I can't just disappear for a month. Then the Red Cross will put it to better use. I kept my voice level, matter of fact. They're listed as the alternative beneficiary in all 3 documents. Gren looked up from his papers, confusion replacing his initial excitement. You want us to move in? Like, actually live here? What about my family? Nellie and the twins can visit, but you'll sleep here, eat breakfast at this table, and spend your days learning what I spent 40 years trying to teach you. This is blackmail, Elvin declared, still pacing. Emotional manipulation. This is choice, I corrected. Choose your inheritance or choose your convenient excuses. But you can't have both. Delmare hadn't spoken since opening his envelope. He stared at the inheritance figure like it was written in a foreign language, probably calculating how many months of rent $700,000 would cover, how many fresh starts it could buy. What exactly would we be doing here? Gren asked, ever the practical one. I mean, what's the point of this? Learning. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 67 years in my joints. Learning that success isn't just about climbing corporate ladders or managing portfolios or whatever it is you do instead of calling your father. For the next hour, they tried every negotiation tactic they could imagine. Elvin offered to visit more frequently, to include me in family vacations, to pay for a luxury retirement home. Gren suggested regular Sunday dinners, holiday gatherings, grandparent privileges with the twins. Delmare just sat silent, clutching his papers like a lifeline. But I'd spent 40 years dealing with union negotiators who could argue the sun out of the sky. These boys were amateurs in comparison. 1 month each, I repeated, starting with Elvin next Monday. Or the Red Cross gets a very generous donation in your names. The room fell silent again as reality settled over them like dust. $700,000 each, more money than any of them had expected, enough to change their lives significantly. But earning it meant spending time with the old man they'd been avoiding for years. Fine. Elvin's surrender came first, clipped and professional. 1 month, but I'm working remotely and I'm not giving up my clients. Acceptable. I turned to Gren. Your answer? He looked at his inheritance papers, then at me, then back at the papers. Nellie's going to have questions. Tell her the truth. Tell her your father is buying back the time you've been too busy to give freely. Okay? His voice carried the resignation of a man who just realized he'd been outmaneuvered. 1 month. Delmare finally looked up from his envelope. And if we refuse? Then you get exactly what you gave me yesterday. Nothing. He nodded slowly, understanding the mathematics of the situation better than his brothers. He had less to lose and more to gain than either Elvin or Gren. When do I start? He asked. After your brothers finish their months. Elvin first, then Gren, then you. By summer, we'll know if this family is worth saving. 3 days later, Elvin arrived with 2 suitcases and a laptop bag, his face set in grim determination like a soldier reporting for unwelcome duty. He'd transform my old bedroom into a temporary office within an hour, cables snaking across the floor like electronic ivy, his multiple monitors glowing with spreadsheets and video conference windows. I'll need uninterrupted time for calls, he announced, hanging suits in the closet with mathematical precision. The Singapore project requires constant communication across time zones. We'll see. I was already planning his first lesson. The interruptions began Tuesday morning. Just as Elvin's voice rose to that important pitch he used with international clients, I knocked on his door. Need help moving the fence posts, I called through the wood. Won't take long. Dad, I'm in a crucial presentation about quarterly projections. The fence posts won't move themselves. By the time he joined me in the backyard, his expensive shirt damp with perspiration and his professional composure cracked, I was already digging the first hole. I can't spend all day hammering nails. His frustration bubbled over as he struggled with tools that felt foreign in his soft hands. This project is worth millions. I couldn't spend 40 years not going to the steel mill every day, I replied, handing him a post-hole digger. But I managed. Each day brought new lessons disguised as chores. Porch repair taught him patience. Garden preparation showed him the value of foundation work. Kitchen renovation demonstrated how careful planning prevented costly mistakes. Principles he claimed to understand in business, but had never applied with his hands. This is different, he protested after a particularly difficult afternoon installing weather stripping. Physical labor isn't the same as strategic thinking. Isn't it? I cleaned my tools with the same methodical care I'd learned in the mill. Every mistake costs time and money. Every shortcut creates bigger problems later. Every day you show up or you don't. And people depend on your choice. The breakthrough came during the 3rd week, over evening tea that had become our unexpected ritual. Elvin sat across from me, his manicured hands wrapped around a mug that had belonged to his mother, staring into the dark liquid like it held answers. Sometimes I'm terrified I'm not living up to expectations, he said quietly, the admission slipping out like a secret he'd been guarding. Every project, every client meeting, every quarterly review, I feel like I'm one mistake away from being exposed as incompetent. Now you know what I've felt my entire life. He looked up, surprised by the parallel. You? But you were so confident, so sure of everything. I was terrified every day that I wouldn't be able to provide for you boys, that the mill would close, that my lack of education would finally catch up with me. I sipped my tea, tasting memories of countless worried nights. The difference is, I couldn't quit. You three depended on me. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. For the first time since childhood, my eldest son saw me as more than just the old man who'd raised him. The remaining week passed differently. Elvin still worked his video conferences, but he also asked questions about the house repairs, about my years at the mill, about lessons he'd missed while climbing his corporate ladder. His hands grew calloused. His suit stayed in the closet more often. On the last morning of March, he packed his belongings with less haste than he'd unpacked them. At the door, he hesitated, his usual efficiency faltering. "I understand now," he said, setting down his suitcase. "What you were trying to teach us." Before I could respond, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me. Not the obligatory holiday hug of recent years, but something real, grateful, and long overdue. The embrace lasted exactly long enough for Gren's family van to pull into the driveway, announcing the beginning of the next month's education. 2 days after Elvin packed his tools and hugged me goodbye, Gren's minivan pulled into the driveway with a different energy entirely, children's laughter spilling out before the doors even opened. Emma bounced from the passenger seat like a spring-loaded toy, her bright yellow backpack trailing behind her, while Liam tumbled out the sliding door with the graceless enthusiasm of an 8-year-old who'd been sitting too long. "Grandpa!" Emma's voice carried across the yard with the pure joy of a child who hadn't yet learned to be disappointed by adults. "Mom says we get to live with you for a whole month." Nellie emerged from the driver's side, looking apologetic in that way mothers perfected when their children displayed too much enthusiasm. "I hope this isn't too much trouble, Mr. Edwards. We brought sleeping bags for the kids." "Nonsense." I was already mentally rearranging furniture, converting my den into a temporary bedroom for Gren and Nellie, setting up the twins in what used to be their father's childhood room. "Family doesn't use sleeping bags in family houses." Gren hung back, supervising the unloading of an impressive collection of toys, clothes, and electronic devices that apparently constituted the minimum survival kit for modern children. His nervousness showed in the way he organized everything twice, checking and rechecking bags that were already perfectly packed. "Dad, are you sure about this? 4 people for a month is a lot." 4 people for a month is what family sounds like. Within hours, my house transformed. Emma's art supplies colonized the kitchen table. Liam's toy cars created elaborate traffic jams across the living room carpet. The twins' constant chatter filled silences that had stretched unbroken for years, their voices weaving through rooms like music I'd forgotten how to hear. "Grandpa, will you teach me chess?" Emma asked after dinner, producing a board that had belonged to her father when he was her age. I'd taught all my boys chess at the same kitchen table, where Emma now arranged pieces with careful precision. Gren watched from the doorway, probably remembering his own lessons from decades earlier, when his biggest worry was whether his king was truly safe behind a wall of pawns. "Your daddy was a good chess player," I told Emma as I explained how each piece moved. "Very strategic, always thinking 3 moves ahead." "Like he does now?" she asked, moving her queen with the confidence of someone who hadn't yet learned the value of patience. "Exactly like he does now." But I was looking at Gren, not Emma, watching his face register surprise that his daughter might inherit his tactical mind. The stories came naturally after that. During evening tea, now served with milk and cookies for smaller hands, I found myself sharing memories of young Gren that I'd kept locked away for years, stories of elaborate blanket forts that spanned 3 rooms, of science projects that required emergency trips to the hardware store, of a boy who once built a functioning periscope from cardboard tubes and mirrors just to spy on his brothers. "Daddy built a periscope?" Liam's eyes widened with the wonder of discovering his father had once been capable of magic. "Your father was brilliant at making something useful from nothing," I said, watching Gren fidget in his chair. "Still is, I imagine." "I didn't even remember you telling us those stories," Gren said quietly after the children went to bed. "You were too busy growing up to remember." The days developed their own rhythm. Mornings meant pancakes with Emma, helping measure ingredients while Liam set the table with mathematical precision. Afternoons brought garden work, 3 generations teaching and learning from each other as we prepared soil for spring planting. Evenings belonged to stories and chess and the comfortable chaos of family life. Gren gradually relaxed, his perpetual hurry replaced by something closer to contentment. Watching his children discover their grandfather seemed to remind him of things he'd forgotten about being their father. "I miss this," he said one evening, as we cleaned up after a particularly messy art project. "Just being together, not rushing to the next thing, then stop rushing." By the end of April, leaving had become the problem none of us wanted to solve. Emma packed her art supplies with theatrical reluctance, sighing dramatically as each crayon disappeared into her backpack. Liam built one final car track, engineering an elaborate system of loops and jumps that would survive only until our next cleaning day. "Grandpa," Emma whispered as Gren loaded their bags into the van, "can we come back soon?" "Anytime you want," I promised, meaning every word. Gren hesitated at the driver's door, watching his children wave goodbye through the rear window. "Dad, save it for next time," I interrupted. "Next time, bring them for the whole summer." His smile told me everything I needed to know about how much had changed in 30 days. The next morning, as Gren's family drove away with promises to visit every weekend, I heard the familiar rumble of Delmare's motorcycle approaching. But this time, the sound carried a different weight. Less defiance, more resignation. The bike sputtered slightly as he parked it, engine trouble that matched the mechanical problems my youngest son had been carrying around for years. Delmare climbed off the motorcycle with the careful movements of someone nursing both a hangover and old emotional wounds. 2 battered duffel bags contained everything he owned, a fact that said more about his life choices than any conversation we'd ever had. "Morning," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact as he shouldered his bags. "Where do you want me?" "Garage first, then we'll see about the rest." My garage had become a graveyard of unfinished projects over the years. Half-built birdhouses, rusted garden tools. And in the corner, covered by a paint-stained tarp, sat my 1967 Mustang. I'd bought it the year Delmare was born, planning to restore it during retirement. 26 years later, retirement had arrived, but motivation had proven more elusive than time. "What's under the tarp?" Delmare asked, curiosity temporarily overriding his defensive posture. "Your education?" I pulled away the covering, revealing cherry red paint dulled by decades of dust and neglect. The chrome needed polishing, the interior required rebuilding, and the engine hadn't run since Clinton was president. But the bones were solid, the frame intact, everything necessary for resurrection was still there. "We're going to fix it?" Delmare's voice carried the first spark of interest I'd heard from him in years. "You're going to fix it. I'm going to supervise." The work began slowly, tentatively. Delmare approached the engine bay like it might bite him, his mechanical knowledge limited to motorcycle maintenance and whatever he'd absorbed through YouTube videos. But his hands were steady, his attention focused in ways I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, building model airplanes in this same garage. "Carburetor's shot," he announced after an hour of careful inspection. "Fuel pump's probably dead too. This hasn't run in forever." Longer than forever, but everything can be rebuilt if you're patient. We worked in comfortable silence most days, communication flowing through pointed fingers and past tools rather than words. Delmare possessed mechanical intuition that his brothers lacked, an ability to sense what engines needed, to hear problems in the subtle changes of sound and rhythm. "Why didn't you ever finish it?" he asked during the second week, his hands deep in the transmission assembly. "Lost motivation after your mother died. Some projects need more than one person's dreams to survive." He nodded without looking up, understanding the weight of abandoned plans better than his successful brothers ever could. The breakthrough came during the 3rd week, over a stubborn carburetor that refused to cooperate despite our best efforts. Delmare had been fighting the same adjustment screw for an hour, his frustration mounting with each failed attempt. "This is useless." He threw his wrench across the garage, the metal clattering against my tool cabinet. "I can't do anything right. You always knew I was a failure." "I knew you felt like a failure," I corrected, retrieving the wrench from where it had fallen. "There's a difference." "Is there?" His voice cracked like a much younger man's. "I've been disappointing you since I learned to walk. Bad grades, bad jobs, bad choices. Everything I touch turns to garbage. The only thing that disappointed me was you running away from me." The words hung between us like a bridge neither of us had expected to find. Delmare stared at the greasy carburetor in his hands, tears mixing with engine oil on his cheeks. "I was afraid of disappointing you more than I already had," he whispered. "Easier to stay away than to keep failing in front of you." "You think your brothers don't fail?" Elvin's terrified his company will discover he's not as smart as his salary suggests. Gren's afraid his kids will grow up and forget him, the way he forgot me. I sat on my workbench, feeling the weight of revelations that had taken months to uncover. Fear of failure isn't weakness, son. Fear of trying is. We worked until sunset that day, the carburetor finally submitting to patient adjustment and proper technique. The engine turned over on the third attempt, coughing to life with a roar that shook dust from the garage rafters. Delmare's face lit up with pure joy, the same expression he'd worn as a 5-year-old watching his first fireworks display. "We did it," he breathed, listening to the engine settle into a steady idle. "It actually runs." "You did it. I just held the flashlight." The remaining week passed in a blur of fine-tuning and polishing, father and son working together to perfect what they had resurrected. By month's end, the Mustang gleamed like new money, its engine purring with the satisfaction of the proper restoration. "Keep it," I told him as he prepared to leave. "Consider it early inheritance." "Dad, I can't." "You can. You built it, you earned it." I handed him the keys, watching emotions flicker across his face like shadows. "Besides, that motorcycle of yours sounds like it's dying." For the first time in years, my youngest son smiled without shame clouding his features. "I understand now why he did this to us." Elvin's voice carried through the thin walls of my kitchen as my 3 sons gathered around the table where I'd served them breakfast for most of their lives. I stood in the hallway, ostensibly checking the thermostat, but actually eavesdropping on the conversation I'd been hoping to hear for months. "We were completely selfish," Gren agreed, his tone carrying the weight of recent revelation. "All those years, all those missed dinners and forgotten calls. Maybe it's time we actually change something," Delmare added, his voice stronger than I'd heard it since before his mother died. "His birthday's next week. We could actually show up this time." 3 months of strategic patience had led to this moment, my sons finally seeing past their own circumstances to recognize the man who'd shaped their entire foundation. The irony wasn't lost on me that my revenge had transformed into the redemption I'd never dared hope for. "He probably expects us to forget again," Elvin said, and I could hear him fidgeting with something on the table, probably his phone, old habits dying slowly. "We've trained him to expect disappointment. Then we surprise him." Gren's organizational mind was already working, planning and calculating like he did for his children's birthday parties. A real celebration, not just showing up, but making it matter. "What is he actually like?" Delmare asked, the question revealing how much distance had grown between us over the years. "I mean, really like, not just what we assume." Listening to them discover how little they knew about my preferences felt like watching archaeologists uncover artifacts from a lost civilization. They debated my favorite foods, my preferred music, my interest beyond the narrow role of father they'd assigned me decades earlier. "He used to love fishing," Gren remembered suddenly. "Remember that lake up near Burton? We'd go every summer when we were kids." "He still has all that gear in the basement," Delmare contributed. "Saw it when I was looking for tools." "When's the last time any of us asked him to go fishing?" Elvin's question landed in silence, the answer obvious to all of them. "So, we plan a fishing trip. Real one, not some half-hearted gesture." Gren's voice carried the determination of a man who'd finally found his mission. "Rent a cabin for the weekend, make it a proper celebration." Over the following days, I watched my sons coordinate with an efficiency they'd never applied to family matters before. Phone calls were made, reservations confirmed, equipment cleaned and organized. They approached my birthday planning with the same attention to detail they'd previously reserved for their careers and personal ambitions. "Dad," Elvin approached me Friday evening as I sat reading in my chair, the same chair where I'd planned their inheritance ultimatum months earlier. "Do you have any plans for next weekend? Nothing that can't be changed?" I kept my voice neutral, curious about how they'd present their surprise. "We thought maybe we could go fishing, all of us, like we used to when we were kids." "That sounds pleasant." Pleasant, as if 3 months of psychological rehabilitation had led to something merely pleasant. "I'd enjoy that." "Great." His relief was palpable. Gren's handling the cabin rental, and Delmare's bringing the boat. Well, borrowing a boat. The details are still being worked out. I'm sure they'll work out fine. That evening, I sat in my kitchen listening to the sounds of genuine family cooperation drifting from the living room. My sons argued about tackle boxes and sleeping arrangements with the comfortable familiarity of people who'd rediscovered they actually liked each other's company. The plan was working better than I'd dared hope. My calculated revenge had evolved into authentic reconciliation, transforming three strangers who shared my DNA back into the sons I'd raised with such careful attention all those years ago. Through the kitchen window, I could see Delmare's restored Mustang parked next to Gren's family van and Elvin's BMW. Three vehicles representing three different approaches to life, but all pointing toward the same destination for the first time in years. Tomorrow would bring my first birthday celebration in longer than I cared to remember. But tonight, I allowed myself the quiet satisfaction of a plan that had succeeded beyond its original parameters, turning revenge into something far more valuable than mere retribution. I understand now why he did this to us. Elvin's voice carried through the thin walls of my kitchen as my three sons gathered around the table where I had served them breakfast for most of their lives. I stood in the hallway, ostensibly checking the thermostat, but actually eavesdropping on the conversation I'd been hoping to hear for months. We were completely selfish, Gren agreed, his tone carrying the weight of recent revelation. All those years, all those missed dinners and forgotten calls. Maybe it's time we actually change something, Delmare added, his voice stronger than I'd heard it since before his mother died. His birthday's next week. We could actually show up this time. 3 months of strategic patience had led to this moment, my sons finally seeing past their own circumstances to recognize the man who'd shaped their entire foundation. The irony wasn't lost on me that my revenge had transformed into the redemption I'd never dared hope for. He probably expects us to forget again, Elvin said, and I could hear him fidgeting with something on the table, probably his phone, old habits dying slowly. We've trained him to expect disappointment. Then we surprise him. Gren's organizational mind was already working, planning and calculating like he did for his children's birthday parties. A real celebration, not just showing up, but making it matter. What is he actually like? Delmare asked, the question revealing how much distance had grown between us over the years. I mean, really like, not just what we assume. Listening to them discover how little they knew about my preferences felt like watching archaeologists uncover artifacts from a lost civilization. They debated my favorite foods, my preferred music, my interests beyond the narrow role of father they'd assigned me decades earlier. He used to love fishing, Gren remembered suddenly. Remember that lake up near Burton? We'd go every summer when we were kids. He still has all that gear in the basement, Delmare contributed. Saw it when I was looking for tools. When's the last time any of us asked him to go fishing? Elvin's question landed in silence, the answer obvious to all of them. So, we plan a fishing trip. Real one, not some half-hearted gesture. Gren's voice carried the determination of a man who'd finally found his mission. Rent a cabin for the weekend, make it a proper celebration. Over the following days, I watched my sons coordinate with an efficiency they'd never applied to family matters before. Phone calls were made, reservations confirmed, equipment cleaned and organized. They approached my birthday planning with the same attention to detail they'd previously reserved for their careers and personal ambitions. Dad, Elvin approached me Friday evening as I sat reading in my chair, the same chair where I'd planned their inheritance ultimatum months earlier. Do you have any plans for next weekend? Nothing that can't be changed. I kept my voice neutral, curious about how they'd present their surprise. We thought maybe we could go fishing, all of us, like we used to when we were kids. That sounds pleasant. Pleasant, as if 3 months of psychological rehabilitation had led to something merely pleasant. I'd enjoy that. Great, his relief was palpable. Gren's handling the cabin rental, and Delmare's bringing the boat. Well, borrowing a boat. The details are still being worked out. I'm sure they'll work out fine. That evening, I sat in my kitchen listening to the sounds of genuine family cooperation drifting from the living room. My sons argued about tackle boxes and sleeping arrangements with the comfortable familiarity of people who'd rediscovered they actually liked each other's company. The plan was working better than I'd dared hope. My calculated revenge had evolved into authentic reconciliation, transforming 3 strangers who shared my DNA back into the sons I'd raised with such careful attention all those years ago. Through the kitchen window, I could see Delmare's restored Mustang parked next to Gren's family van and Elvin's BMW. 3 vehicles representing 3 different approaches to life, but all pointing toward the same destination for the first time in years. Tomorrow would bring my first birthday celebration in longer than I cared to remember. But tonight, I allowed myself the quiet satisfaction of a plan that had succeeded beyond its original parameters, turning revenge into something far more valuable than mere retribution. The morning of my 68th birthday arrived with the sound of car doors slamming in my driveway at 8 a.m., 3 hours earlier than any of my sons had visited in years. Through my bedroom window, I watched them huddle together near Elvin's BMW, their animated gestures suggesting conspiracy rather than casual gathering. Delmare carried a cooler that seemed too heavy for fishing tackle. Gren wrestled with what appeared to be decorations poorly concealed in garbage bags. Elvin coordinated their movements with the efficiency of a project manager, checking his phone and pointing toward different entry points around my house. I dressed slowly, savoring the irony of roles reversed from February's disaster. Then, I'd waited desperately for sons who never came. Now they waited anxiously outside, probably terrified I'd discover their surprise before the proper moment. "Morning, Dad," Elvin called as I emerged onto the porch, his voice carrying artificial casualness. "Beautiful day for fishing, don't you think?" "Perfect weather," I agreed, noting how Gren quickly positioned himself between me and the garage, where suspicious rustling sounds suggested hidden activity. "When do we leave?" "Actually, we thought you might want to run some errands first," Delmare suggested, his nervousness making him speak too quickly. "You know, give us time to load the boat and organize equipment." "Errands on my birthday?" I raised an eyebrow, enjoying their discomfort. "Just small things," Gren jumped in. "Maybe visit the hardware store or drive around town. Take your time." Their transparent attempt at manipulation amused me more than it should have. After months of psychological maneuvering, watching my sons try to deceive me felt like teaching children to play chess, earnest effort undermined by obvious tells. "I suppose I could check on a few things," I conceded, grabbing my keys with theatrical reluctance. "But don't wait too long. Fish bite better in the morning." I drove aimlessly through Cleveland for 4 hours, passing landmarks that measured the distance between past disappointment and present hope. The steel mill where I'd worked 40 years stood empty now, its smokestacks silent monuments to an industrial age that had shaped my character, but not my son's understanding. At 2 o'clock, I returned home to find my driveway crowded with vehicles I recognized. Not just my son's cars, but Nellie's sedan and several others belonging to neighbors and old friends I hadn't seen in months. The conspiracy had expanded beyond family bounds. "Surprise!" The chorus erupted as I opened my front door, though the words seemed inadequate for the transformation I discovered inside. My living room had been decorated with streamers and balloons, but more importantly, it was filled with people who mattered. Emma and Liam bounced with barely contained excitement. Nellie smiled with the satisfaction of successful planning. Even Mrs. Henderson from next door held a covered dish that smelled like her famous apple pie. "Dad?" Elvin stepped forward, his usual professional composure replaced by something more genuine. "We want to show you that we really do love you. This time, we won't let you down," Gren added, his arm wrapped around his children as if they were anchors keeping him grounded in this moment. "Thank you for not giving up on us," Delmare said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of months spent rebuilding more than just automobile engines. I looked around the room at faces turned toward me with expressions I hadn't seen in years. Attention, affection, genuine pleasure in my presence. The dining table, scene of February's lonely vigil, now overflowed with food and family and the comfortable chaos of celebration. "I never gave up," I replied, my voice steadier than my emotions. "I was just waiting for you to come back." The afternoon passed in a blur of conversation and laughter, stories shared, and memories rebuilt. My granddaughter presented me with a hand-drawn picture of our family fishing together. My grandson demonstrated the chess moves I'd taught him during Gren's month. Friends and neighbors who'd watched my sons grow up marveled at how much they'd changed. As evening approached and guests began departing, I found myself watching my sons clean up together without being asked. Elvin dried dishes while Gren folded chairs. Delmare swept the kitchen floor with the same careful attention he'd applied to engine restoration. In my pocket, Stella's letter crinkled softly as I shifted position. 4 months ago, her words had launched me toward revenge. Tonight, they felt like artifacts from someone else's life, evidence of pain that had transformed into something unexpectedly precious. The time had come to complete the circle, to reveal the catalyst that had driven everything they'd experienced. My sons deserved to know the truth about their father's motivation, even if that truth might complicate their newfound appreciation. The week after my birthday, as the joy settled into something deeper and more permanent, I called all 3 sons back to the house where this journey began. The same living room that had witnessed their inheritance ultimatum would now host the final revelation, completing a circle that had started with Stella's devastating honesty. "I have something to tell you," I announced as they settled into the same chairs they'd occupied months earlier. But this time, their posture reflected confidence rather than defensive anxiety. "Something you need to understand about why I really designed those months you spent here." Elvin leaned forward with interest rather than suspicion. "We figured you wanted to teach us about family responsibility." That was part of it. I reached into my shirt pocket, withdrawing the cream-colored envelope that had triggered everything. But there was something more specific that convinced me drastic action was necessary. The letter felt different in my hands now, lighter somehow, its power to wound diminished by the healing it had ultimately produced. My sons watched with curious expressions as I unfolded Stella's familiar handwriting. "This arrived the night of my 67th birthday," I explained, noting how their faces tensed at the mention of that painful anniversary. "From Stella Campbell, my childhood friend. She'd encountered you boys at Riverside Cafe." I began reading aloud, watching their expressions shift from curiosity to recognition to mortification, as Stella's words revealed their casual dismissal of their father's importance. "When I mentioned you, their faces changed. They consider you old-fashioned and boring. Elvin actually laughed when someone mentioned your birthday party." Delmare's face flushed red as his own words came back to him through Stella's observations. Gren gripped his chair arms until his knuckles whitened. Elvin stared at the floor, probably calculating how many mutual acquaintances had witnessed their humiliating conversation. "Did we really say those things about you?" Elvin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "According to someone who cared enough to warn me, yes." I folded the letter carefully, returning it to my pocket. "Now you know what drove me to this." "You could have just talked to us," Gren protested, though his tone suggested he already knew the futility of that approach. "I tried, but you weren't listening." I looked at each of them in turn, seeing men who had genuinely changed rather than boys making temporary adjustments to secure inheritance. "The question isn't whether you said those things. The question is whether you still believe them." The silence stretched for long minutes as my sons processed the revelation that their father had orchestrated months of psychological rehabilitation based on overheard criticism. The manipulation might have angered them once. Now it seemed to sadden them. "We were idiots," Delmare said finally, his honesty cutting through the tension. "Sitting in public, talking about you like you were some embarrassing obligation instead of the man who sacrificed everything for us. The inheritance ultimatum, the monthly stays, even the specific projects you assigned us." Elvin worked through the implications with his analytical mind. "You designed everything to address what we'd said about you." "What matters isn't what you said," I replied. "What matters is what you learned." "That you were never boring," Gren said softly. "That old-fashioned meant principled and reliable. That we were the ones who'd become small and selfish." The remaining conversation focused on mutual apologies and new understanding. My sons expressed genuine remorse for words spoken carelessly, but overheard painfully. I explained how Stella's letter had crystallized years of growing distance into a specific plan for reconciliation. "The inheritance was always yours," I assured them, as we concluded our discussion. "The conditions were just my way of making sure you'd be worthy of it." "And the Red Cross?" Delmare asked with a small smile. "They would have received a generous donation anyway. But I'm glad it's coming from grateful sons rather than a disappointed father." As they prepared to leave, each of my boys approached me individually, not with the obligation of scheduled visits, but with the natural affection of family members who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. The letter had served its purpose, transforming from a source of pain into a catalyst for healing. Stella's friendship had given me exactly what I needed, the truth that set us all free. Sunday dinners became the cornerstone of our rebuilt family structure, replacing the sporadic holiday visits that had previously defined our relationship. The first officially instituted gathering took place the weekend after Stella's letter revelation, with all three sons arriving promptly at 4 o'clock, a miracle that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. "I understand now that family matters more than career," Elvin announced, as he helped set the table, his expensive suits permanently retired for these occasions in favor of comfortable clothes suitable for actual participation in household activities. "The kids absolutely love their time with Grandpa," Gren added, watching Emma teach me to braid friendship bracelets while Liam demonstrated the proper technique for paper airplane construction. "They ask about you every day." "I finally know where home is," Delmare contributed, arriving early to help with food preparation using skills he'd learned during his month of kitchen duty. "It's not a place. It's people who actually want you around." Each son had maintained individual connections beyond our weekly gatherings. Elvin called Tuesday evenings to discuss business strategies and seek advice about workplace challenges, discovering that 40 years of labor management had taught me negotiation and principles no MBA program could match. Gren brought the twins every Saturday morning for chess lessons and story time, building traditions that would survive long after I was gone. Delmare spent Wednesday afternoons in the garage, working on various automotive projects, while we talked about everything and nothing with the comfortable rhythm of people who no longer needed to prove their worth to each other. "The best revenge," I observed one evening as we cleaned up after a particularly boisterous family dinner, "is turning enemies into friends." "Were we really enemies?" Gren asked, genuinely puzzled by the description. "You were strangers who happened to share my DNA," I corrected, "which is worse than enemies, because enemies at least acknowledge each other's existence." The transformation extended beyond our immediate family. Nellie had begun accompanying Gren to our Sunday dinners, adding her own recipes to our rotation, and providing the feminine perspective our masculine household had lacked since my wife's death. Emma and Liam treated my house as their second home, leaving toys in strategic locations and filling the silence with the constant chatter of children who felt genuinely welcome. Vacation plans emerged naturally from our renewed connection. A fishing trip to the same lake where I'd taught my sons to cast lines 30 years earlier, a long weekend visiting the Baseball Hall of Fame, sharing my passion for statistics and history with grandchildren who found my encyclopedic knowledge of 1960s pitching rotations genuinely fascinating rather than embarrassingly outdated. "You know what's funny?" Delmare observed during one of our garage sessions, his hands covered in grease as he adjusted the carburetor on a neighbor's lawnmower we'd volunteered to repair. "I spent years thinking you disapproved of everything I did. Turns out you were just waiting for me to start doing things worth approving." "I was never disappointed in who you were," I replied, handing him the correct wrench without being asked. "I was disappointed in who you thought you had to be." The Mustang became a symbol of our relationship's restoration, not just the car itself, but what it represented about patience, attention to detail, and the willingness to invest time in projects that might not show immediate results. Neighbors often stopped to admire Delmare's workmanship, and their praise reflected back on the teacher who'd guided the restoration process. "Amazing what that boy accomplished in just 1 month," Mrs. Henderson commented after church one Sunday, unaware of the deeper rebuilding project the car restoration had facilitated. "Amazing what can happen when someone believes in your potential," I agreed. Late June brought my favorite evening ritual. Sitting on the front porch after dinner, watching Delmare teach Emma the basics of automotive maintenance while Gren and Liam played catch in the yard. And Elvin arrived early for dinner, rather than rushing away from previous obligations. The sounds of family life filled spaces that had been empty for too long. Stella's letter remained in my shirt pocket, not as a reminder of past hurt, but as proof that sometimes the most painful truths can produce the most beautiful outcomes. My plan for revenge had succeeded beyond its original scope, creating something far more valuable than mere retribution. Watching my granddaughter learn to check oil levels while my son explained the importance of regular maintenance, I realized that the best victories weren't about defeating enemies. They were about transforming the battlefield into a place where everyone could thrive. The empty chairs around my dining table had been filled. The silence in my house had been replaced by laughter. The disappointment in my heart had been transformed into gratitude for sons who'd finally become the men I'd always known they could be. Revenge, I discovered, was sweetest when it healed rather than harmed, when it built rather than destroyed, when it turned a father's disappointment into a family's redemption. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.